The early 2000s were most definitely some of the most exciting times to be a JRPG fan. Square was still at the height of its powers, and nearly every Japanese game developer dipped their toes into the JRPG sphere with a variety of interesting concepts for the genre. Not every idea worked when actually shipped to market, but there's no denying that developers back then were more willing to make risky moves. A lot of classic JRPGs come from the PS2 era of video games, and we still have yet to return to such heights. One particularly interesting experiment was dothack, which was actually a multimedia project created by Japanese media giant Bandai and game developer CyberConnect 2, which you might know as the creator of various anime-based arena fighters like Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm and, more recently, games like Fuga Melodies of Steel. Centering around a series of incidents surrounding a fictional virtual reality MMO known as The World, the dothack franchise is made up of multiple anime series, manga, and novels. In this video, however, I'm looking at the original dothack quadrilogy of games, which together form one of the franchise's most important plot lines. The first 4 dothack games, subtitled Infection, Mutation, Outbreak, and Quarantine, were released between 2002 and 2003, and follow the story of Kite, a player whose friend went comatose after encountering a mysterious monster in the world. In order to find out what happened to his friend, Kite begins exploring the world, making both friends and enemies along the way. His adventures lead him towards a mysterious prophecy, and a strange phenomenon that threatens not only the virtual world, but the real world as well. While this story certainly has its elements of intrigue, the real appeal of dothack as a video game is to give players a simulated experience of playing the world itself. It certainly does so in a primitive way, which can't be helped since it came out before a lot of genre-defining MMOs like World of Warcraft. Even so, the choices it makes are certainly inspired, and while it doesn't sell the experience completely, you have to respect the attempt. You start the game not within the world, but on a computer homepage. You can receive messages from your friends, read news articles, and log into the world itself, where the main meat of the game actually is. Once you've logged on, you can call up your friends to form a party to go dungeon crawling, or run around town finding player characters to trade with. Some of the best equipment and items in these games are found through trading, so you're seriously incentivized to engage in these trades. These are small, little details, but they do a lot to sell the idea that you are playing in the world rather than a dothack game, and it was probably even more impressive in the context of 2002. For all that the simulative aspects do to hold up the concept of dothack, the actual game experience never really managed to live up to it in execution. My playthrough of the 4 games started off quite optimistically, and I really was enjoying the experience and the atmosphere the games were trying to provide. By the end, however, the experience of playing the game became rather frustrating and tedious, and I can boil the reasons for why down to 3 major complaints. The first complaint is centered around the combat. Dothack is an action RPG, but it really shouldn't be. You can run around and attack as expected, but nearly everything else is essentially done through a menu. Want to use a skill? Open up a menu. Want to cast magic? Open up a menu. Want to give your party members an order? You better open up that menu. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if the actual action combat was interesting, but it's not. Attacking is repetitive with no semblance of skill or strategy necessary. You can move around to avoid attacks, but if you get targeted by a spell or skill, you can't dodge. I mean it. You'll literally be frozen in place so that the enemy's spell will hit you. At that point, the game should just be turn-based, especially since dodging is still mostly based on your stats rather than whether you get out of the way or not. So the combat isn't fun. But the areas and dungeons you can visit aren't all that fun either, which is bad since that's where you'll be spending 90% of your time in. Dothack is all about dungeon crawling, and it has a very unique mechanic where you can use keywords to adjust and customize these areas, though I gotta admit, I never really figured out how it worked and never bothered with it since the game just gives you keywords through the story anyway. Not that I would have spent much time with it otherwise, since most of these dungeons are rather bland and boring. There are really only a handful of area environments, and while the games themselves aren't too long, at least relative to other JRPGs, having to see the same areas and dungeons over the course of 4 games certainly makes it easy to get tired of them. The layouts of the dungeons aren't procedurally generated either. Once you've visited a dungeon, you know pretty much how it will map out every time you go there. There's a serious lack of overall interactivity too, and any particular area isn't going to have you doing much other than combat, which we've already established is tedious in itself. These 2 complaints alone take what could have been an interesting concept and turn it into a rough, tedious slog. This last complaint, however, isn't just a problem by itself, it also magnifies the others. You see, there's one last very important mechanic in dothack that I haven't really talked about yet, and that is data drain. Data Drain is a unique ability that only Kite can use. It powers down an enemy and gives you either an item or a virus core at the cost of increasing his infection level. It is a core mechanic of the original dothack games, and you will be data draining likely hundreds of times before the quadrilogy is over. What's a virus core, you ask? Well, as you go through the game, you are eventually introduced to protected areas, which can only be accessed by gate hacking. In order to hack a protected area, however, you need a number of virus cores. The majority of protected areas, if not all of them, are story important and therefore required, which means you have to gate hack a lot, which means you need a lot of virus cores, which means you have to grind. Now, despite being a JRPG fan, I've never liked grinding, but grinding for virus cores is a special kind of infuriating. See, you can't data drain an enemy right away. You have to weaken them until the message Protect Break pops up. However, Protect Break doesn't always show up consistently across monsters. Sometimes it shows up only after a certain amount of damage is taken, or sometimes it only shows up after a certain amount of hits. Sometimes Protect Break doesn't show up at all. Tough luck. To add to this, certain virus cores only show up in certain areas and from certain monsters. That means if you're a few steps from the endgame, but you have to go back to an earlier area to farm cores, you might be too strong to even trigger a Protect Break. You also don't know how many virus cores you'll need throughout the 4 games. That means, unless you go looking it up like I did, most players will end up farming virus cores preemptively just to avoid getting soft locked. The infection level mechanic that I mentioned before plays a role in all of this as well. Kite's infection level goes up every time he data drains an enemy, and if his infection level gets too high, it's game over. Even worse, your chance of obtaining virus cores actually goes down the higher your infection level is. This means the optimal way to obtain virus cores is to fight an enemy, data drain him, then kill a bunch of other enemies without data draining to bring down your infection level before data draining again. Remember, virus cores aren't guaranteed either, so you could clear an entire area doing all this and still not end up with the virus cores you need. I will admit that the later games in the quadrilogy tried to throw you a bone by having some of the lower level virus cores occasionally randomly appear in dungeons from time to time. However, they're so inconsistent and unreliable that I assume most people will just end up farming them beforehand anyway. If you're lucky, you might be able to get them while going through the story, but in my experience, you'll always end up having to grind for them at some point. Data drain also has a rather negative impact in combat as well. You see, most story-related bosses start with a special protection that essentially makes them immune to all attacks until they are data drained. It's a cool idea in concept, but it is incredibly tedious in execution. There's not much point in using skills or spells here since the damage done doesn't matter, which means most boss battles consist of you mashing the attack button and keeping your life up while praying for the Protect Break message to appear. For some endgame bosses, you might be doing this for 10 or more minutes. It's just not a fun experience, and it only gets worse the deeper you get into the quadrilogy. After all that, if you're wondering whether I'd still recommend playing the original dothack games, my answer is maybe. If you're a JRPG fan and you want to experience a truly historic entry in the genre, despite all its flaws, I'd say go for it. It does have a really interesting concept, and the way it simulates the MMO experience is probably worth at least a few hours of your time. After that, it's up to you if you want to complete the whole series like I did. The story isn't super compelling, and the characters aren't much of a draw either. dothack did receive a sequel trilogy in dothack GU, which is more readily available on Steam and modern consoles. To be honest, it plays a lot better than the original games, and its combat is a lot closer to what I would expect from a game billed as an action RPG. It's even got a pretty interesting story too, and Haseo as a character is far more interesting than Kite ever was. However, it's not really as focused on simulating the MMO experience like the original games were. You might not think it matters much, but to be honest, while I had a much better time going through the dothack GU trilogy, I also couldn't help feeling like some of the magic was gone. It's a funny thing to say after spending way too much of this video complaining about the games, but the original dothack quadrilogy did have something to it other more conventional JRPGs didn't have. At the end of the day, this may be something you're going to have to trust your own gut on. If you're at all intrigued by anything I've told you about the game, I definitely recommend giving it a try. It's certainly got an atmosphere all its own, and it is proof positive of just how inventive JRPGs could be back in the day. Thanks for watching. The dothack games have their share of flaws, but there's no denying it has a strong fanbase as well. If you've played the dothack games, let me know about your experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear about them. Subscribe if you want to catch what I've got coming up, and I'll see you next time.